February 16, 1919, Nebraska became the 38th state to vote in favor of a new amendment to the Constitution, and officially, the 18th Amendment was passed, banning alcohol. This was the first time that there was an amendment that took rights away from citizens instead of giving them rights. The law gave people 1 year to prepare. Imagine, it's January 1920. You're dressed warm on this freezing day. You're outside marching in a parade. At the head of the parade is the famous preacher Billy Sunday. He leads the parade while everyone sings and cheers. The parade is a stunning sight. Pallbearers are carrying a coffin, and behind the coffin is a man dressed as the devil. He is marching sadly behind the coffin while everyone else is cheering. Someone asks, "Whose funeral is this?" You shout back, "It's John Barleycorn, my dear friend. We're finally rid of alcohol." Why is his coffin huge? It's 20 feet long. You laugh at that person asking those silly questions. Why does it have to be so long? Inside are all the problems Barleycorn brought us. The sinful activities of the saloon, the gambling, the prostitution, the broken families, all gone. The crowd is singing as they march. The men in the crowd are digging a hole. The coffin full of alcohol is buried while Billy Sunday leads the crowd in praising God. But how is society going to react to this change? And will things get any better? Welcome back to the Church History Podcast. I'm your host, Lauralee Siemens. 2 episodes ago, I told you the story of the preacher Billy Sunday. And in our last episode, we looked at how Billy Sunday was part of the movement to create a dry America. On January 16th, 1919, Nebraska became the 38th state to vote in favor of the amendment, and the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. America was dry. At the start of this episode, you heard Billy Sunday lead a parade and a funeral for alcohol. The saloons also held funerals, but their funerals were not celebrations. After America became dry, some saloon owners moved to Mexico and set up saloons in Tijuana. The city became the place to go if you wanted to drink. People began to call it Sin City. The temperance movement called the border the road to hell. But the saloons in Tijuana became popular almost right away. The government actually had to set up a curfew for Americans who were re-entering America from Tijuana. By 1924, customs and immigration officials enforced a 9 p.m. closing time. This made sure that day trippers heading to Mexico to drink would have to leave the bar early or be forced to stay in Mexico until 8 the following morning. 2 years into Prohibition, people were angry that so many Californians were headed across the border to drink that the government moved the closing of the border to 6 p.m. The town of Tijuana had become a popular destination, and it was a place for Mexicans to move to set up shops that would attract American tourists. At the start of Prohibition, only 1,200 people lived in Tijuana, and by 1933, the population had grown to 12,000. But in America, the saloon owners and breweries that stayed had to find a way to pivot. In Milwaukee, there were 100 breweries and 91 of them closed. That meant a lot of jobs were gone overnight. The same story was true across America and all the states. That's when America discovered a drink that had been available for a while, but had not been very popular: the soda drink. The few breweries that stayed open began to make soda drinks, and many saloons that had closed found a way to reopen. Instead of marketing to the working man, they started marketing to families, and the dark, shuttered saloons that were full of drinking, gambling, fighting, political movements, and prostitution reopened as friendly, fun-filled places for the family to come for an ice cream or to experience the soda fountain. The bartenders became soda jerks, and families enjoyed watching the soda jerks show their skills as they mixed ice cream, sodas, egg cream, and malts. This actually became the popular Sunday afternoon activity after church. The entertainment in the saloons had not been appropriate for the new audience, so the saloons found a new entertainment, the radio. Most families could not afford a radio, so boys would gather at the soda shop to listen to the sports games being broadcasts. Girls would gather to hear their favorite soap, and in between, music was playing. On August the 5th, 1919, the first ever ball game broadcast went live over the airwaves. It was the Pirates versus the Phillies, and the soda shops were packed with dads and little boys listening to the game and enjoying a malt. People needed a pastime without all the fathers drinking. Visiting sporting events became a favorite pastime, but they soon discovered playing sports was even better than watching it. Golf and baseball became the most popular sports for young men and boys. With everyone looking for something to do, movie theaters started to get a bigger audience, making studios spend more money on their films, and thus Hollywood stars were born. Marion Davies and Charlie Chaplin were Hollywood stars from this era. Dance crazes took off. The foxtrot, Charleston, Lindy Hop, the jitterbug. Couples would meet in the soda shop to play music and dance. Drunk and disorderly charges dropped overnight. And cirrhosis and liver failure fell substantially. Historians use health and crime stats to estimate that Americans were drinking about 1/3 less than before Prohibition. And it seemed that the preacher Billy Sunday was right. A dry America was much better than a drunk America. Now, you heard me say people were drinking less. And you might think, what do you mean by less? Don't you mean they weren't drinking at all? Actually, drinking alcohol was never illegal. Selling and buying alcohol was what was illegal. So during the year when people knew alcohol was about to be banned, people bought and stocked up. The wealthy people in America built wine cellars in their homes to ensure they would always have wine available. In fact, even the White House built a wine shop, and the president brought his collection to the White House. People also found ways to work around the ban on alcohol. One of those ways was a doctor's note. Doctors claimed that alcohol could cure cancer, indigestion, depression, and so much more. So, if you got a doctor's note, you could head down to your local pharmacy with your subscription in hand and get yourself a drink. Most doctors charged $3 for this, so it was a huge money-making gig for them. In the first few months of Prohibition, 15,000 doctors applied for the right to give prescriptions for alcohol. In fact, at one point, Winston Churchill visited New York, and he made sure to bring along his doctor's note to ensure he would have a drink with every meal. Now, there were very few pharmacies at the start of Prohibition, but they soon started popping up in every town. And guess where they set up shop? In the local soda shop. One example is a pharmacy started by Charles R. Walgreen in Chicago in 1901. By 1919, Charles had 20 stores all the way across America. But when Prohibition started and Charles Walgreen saw his pharmacy could make money selling prescriptions of alcohol, his business took off. In just a couple of years, he had 525 Walgreen pharmacies across America. In fact, under Prohibition, the Walgreens business increased by 2,500%. Eventually, the government caught on to this and began cracking down on the doctors and telling them they could not give out as many prescriptions. As the doctors' notes dried up, so did the wine cellars, and people needed to find a new way to get drinks. Some made their own homemade distilleries. Unfortunately, many didn't know that the first batch of the homemade distillery was poisonous and was supposed to be thrown away. This caused a lot of illnesses and even deaths. Meanwhile, across the border in Canada, the government had left it up to each individual province. And while at first Canada seemed to be on board with Prohibition, it didn't take long for the border towns to realize they could make a lot of money off of Americans if they allowed alcohol. And because of that, many towns started to allow drinking as a way to promote the American tourist. Then a man named McCoy realized that France still owned 2 little islands off of Canada, and France definitely allowed alcohol, especially wine, and they had the best wine. These 2 islands were close to New York, and McCoy started to bring wine from the islands back to America. His name, McCoy, became known for the best wines, and everyone wanted to make sure they were getting the real McCoy. As the availability of drinks became less and less, the cost of alcohol became more and more. And this made for some capitalistic thinking. Unfortunately, since it was illegal, the businessmen who turned to this income were the mob. The Italian mob, the Irish mob, the Polish mob all began to sell alcohol, and this led to wars and fights between the groups. In just a few years, over 1,000 men were killed during mob clashes between these groups. The Sicily Mafia got involved as well. While gangs had existed before Prohibition, they were scarce. But now, they had become more than just hoodlums and bandits. Now, they were businessmen in suits. Prohibition created organized crime in America. Alcohol was often hidden in the boots of the people carrying it, and thus the name bootlegger was created. Beyond that, we have terms mob boss, mob families, vice king. Many of these mob families still exist today. The famous Italian mob, 5 Families of New York, became extremely wealthy and powerful. Of course, Al Capone was the most famous of these mobsters. Another one was Frank Costello, who is the man who inspired the movie series The Godfather. Then came the underground saloons known as the speakeasy. There is no data to show how many speakeasies were opened during this time, but we know that they were in the thousands. The most popular cities were New York, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Cleveland had at least 3,000 speakeasies. To keep them open, police, judges, politicians were bribed. Corruption became part of everyday life. Unlike the pre-Prohibition saloons, the speakeasies were for both men and women. These secret bars were in fancy hotels, expensive restaurants, and even in back rooms of grocery stores. The very wealthy, the elites, were drinking here. Musicians singing in these speakeasies were often discovered by producers. Helen Morgan was just one example of a singer who became famous after singing in the speakeasies. She went on to Hollywood and starred in movies like Sweet Music and Frankie and Johnny. As the 1920s came to an end, families were doing much better without alcohol, but the rise in crime families was concerning. Because crime families were mostly ethnic, a lot of people started to see immigration as the problem instead of alcohol. The alcohol that was making it into America was coming from other countries, and the mob families were mostly immigrants. So the solution for many people was to get rid of the immigrants. Grocery stores owned by immigrants were vandalized. Even the homes of immigrants had their windows broken. Samuel Brofman was a Jewish man from Canada. He ran alcohol to the U.S. through Lake Erie, and the lake became known as the Jewish Lake. Now, while Jewish people never had a large drinking culture, and alcohol was basically absent from Jewish communities, the Jewish community very much opposed prohibition. They saw it as a Protestant religious law and didn't think it was a good idea. The Jewish community also used alcohol as part of Jewish traditions. Marriage, circumcision, the Passover, and the Seder were all Jewish rituals, and they all involved wine. The final reason the Jewish community opposed prohibition was they saw it as an attack on business. Many winemakers from Europe were Jewish, and the prohibition hurt their businesses. In fact, Jews comprised only 5% of the population, but 50% of the saloon keepers. People who already held anti-Jewish feelings used prohibition as a reason to attack the Jewish communities. They blamed them for the rise in crime, and when some rabbis were discovered selling alcohol, the anti-Jewish rhetoric began to rise even more. Then, because of a movie called The Birth of a Nation, a group that had been popular right after the Civil War came back into popularity, the Ku Klux Klan. In the fall, we're going to do an entire episode on the Ku Klux Klan, but in this episode, we're just talking about how the Klan acted during Prohibition. The KKK was part of the anti-alcohol group and was willing to literally fight to end underground alcohol distribution. The KKK started to burn crosses in front of Jewish-run businesses and synagogues. They also attacked and burned crosses in front of other immigrant-run businesses and even homes. Things were not going well in America. These are the reasons why people who had fought for prohibition were suddenly against it. There was a feeling that if so many politicians and lawmakers were not enforcing prohibition, it would be better to not have it at all, because there was a breakdown in law and a breakdown in the trust of law. This was not just a law against drinking. This was in the Constitution. If politicians and law enforcement could just ignore one part of the Constitution, then they could also ignore other parts of the Constitution. Wouldn't it be better to not have prohibition than to have it and not have it be enforced? When the Great Depression hit America, many began to think that perhaps a way to save America was to bring back alcohol. Breweries would bring in jobs, and alcohol would bring in tax revenue that could be used to help struggling families. The start of World War I had made prohibition more popular, with a connection to patriotism and refusing to drink alcohol. Now, it was the Great Depression that connected patriotism and alcohol beverages that suddenly started a push to end prohibition. The church was still extremely opposed to drinking and fought hard to keep prohibition. During this time, the Women's Christian Temperance Union received its highest number of members. They would fight hard to keep the ban in place. President Hoover's response to the veterans' protests in Washington, D.C. in 1932 was marked by frustration and ultimately a firm stance to maintain law and order. As thousands of World War I vets, who were known as the Bonus Army, came to the National's capital to demand immediate payment of their bonus certificates, Hoover faced a challenging situation. At first, President Hoover showed compassion towards the veterans, understanding their plight during the Great Depression, and he authorized distribution of foods and directed the Army to provide them with shelter. However, the protests grew and the makeshift camps began to grow and spring up everywhere. Hoover grew concerned about the potential for civil unrest. The veterans were demanding early payment for their bonuses, and when these were not met, tensions escalated, and Hoover faced pressure from Congress and military leaders to get rid of these protesters. People were concerned for public safety and sanitation. Hoover ultimately ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear the veterans' camps and to use force if necessary. The eviction of the bonus army from their camps that was carried out by the army under MacArthur's command was a pivotal moment in Hoover's presidency. They used tear gas, the cavalry, the infantry to disperse the protesters, and this resulted in clashes and even casualties. This included veterans and their families. Across the newspaper were images of the military forcibly removing war veterans, including women and their children, from these encampments. The nation was shocked, and President Hoover's image was damaged forever. By the time we have the election of 1932, President Hoover was basically the most hated man in America. And in that year's election, he ran against a man who had promised to end the prohibition, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was voted into office with 472 electoral votes. It was a landslide. 1933 would see the end of prohibition. But getting rid of an amendment in the Constitution wasn't easy. The first thing Roosevelt did was find a loophole. After all, what was alcohol? Roosevelt changed the definition of alcohol, making low-alcohol beer and wine legal and taxable. February 20th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed into law the Collin-Harrison Act, allowing the manufacturing and sale of low-alcohol beer and wine. The Collin-Harrison Act, signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933, allowed for the sale of beer with a maximum alcohol content of 3.2 by weight, basically legalizing the sale of low-alcohol beverages. The day he signed the legislation, Roosevelt made this famous remark: "I think this would be a good time for a beer." On December 5th, Utah became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, achieving the 3/4 majority required to repeal prohibition. On December 15th, prohibition officially ends with ratifying the 21st Amendment of the United States Constitution. December 20th, President Roosevelt signed the 21st Amendment, formally repealing the 18th Amendment and ending prohibition nationwide. Now, it's really important to note that no one wanted the pre-prohibition life back. The saloons would not open first thing in the morning, and states made sure that there was age requirements. In places where alcohol was not allowed, there would be no more drunk workers on the factory line. And many states stayed dry and continued to ban alcohol. And inside states that did allow alcohol, there were counties that stayed dry. I like to think about it like this. When my internet goes out, I unplug it, wait a few minutes, and then plug it back in. That's kind of what happened with alcohol in America. 3 years after the end of Prohibition, in 1935, Billy Sunday died. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is still active today. They still work to educate people on the dangers of drinking, and they still try to pass laws that restrict alcohol and make it harder to buy. In church culture, alcohol was still looked at as shameful, and the church realized the only way to help families was Jesus Christ, not in passing laws. There was one man who helped the church realize this, and his name was William Griffith Wilson. William, who went by Bill, was born in Vermont in 1895, and his parents abandoned him at the age of 10 when they just up and moved to Canada without him. Bill had a very troubled youth, but in high school his life started to improve. He was the captain of the football team, and he played violin. He also was dating a young lady named Bertha Bamford, who he loved. But when Bertha died suddenly from complications from a surgery, he became depressed. In 1913, he met a girl named Lois, and he was accepted into university. Things were starting to look up, but then he was kicked out of school after a hazing incident. So then, Will entered the military, and in the military, he had his first drink. In 1918, Bill married Lois, and then left to fight World War I. After the war, Will's drinking was out of control. Even though this was during Prohibition, Will was one of the people who always found a way to drink. In 1933, Will was told if he didn't stop drinking, he would be dead soon. And that is when Will became involved in the Christian group known as Oxford Group. And that was when Will had a relationship with Jesus Christ and became a believer in God. And that is when he finally found a way to be free from the control of alcohol. He wanted to find a way to help others, so he started a group known as Friends of Will. And eventually that became known as Alcoholics Anonymous. At first, the club was actually called James Club because the men would study the book of James. But eventually it was Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, that stuck. In church basements across America, men trying to find the courage to stop drinking met to drink coffee and take responsibility for their actions. There were 12 steps to walk through, and each step had a prayer. This was the church after Prohibition. So what about organized crime? Well, it didn't go away after Prohibition ended. Following the end of Prohibition on December 5th, 1933, organized crime faced a significant shift in its operation. Without their primary source of illegal income, many gangsters adapted to find new ways for profit. Some did open just legal liquor businesses, but with tighter restrictions, that meant they had less earnings. However, the underworld wasn't short on opportunities. Prostitution, gambling, drug trafficking, and labor racketeering remained lucrative ventures for organized crime. And organized crime continued to thrive. However, legal troubles did catch up with some of them, leading them to convictions and prison terms in the mid-1930s. But some set their sights on a town that seemed more open to their types of business: Las Vegas and the legal casino industry. This laid the foundation for the mob's involvement in the city's underworld, especially during the 1940s. Now, during Prohibition, Sin City was in Mexico, but now Las Vegas became the new Sin City, and the American-owned saloons from Tijuana moved to Las Vegas. And that is the story of Prohibition in America. Tune in next week where we're going to continue our story of church history. If you want to hear more stories or more videos, check out my website at lauraleesiemens.com.